My corporate brother tried to quietly liquidate my restoration workshop, so I let him complete the auction. For 3 years, I dedicated my life to preserving my late grandfather's antique horology workshop, keeping his legacy alive through meticulous manual restoration. My older brother Logan had always openly despised this trade, choosing instead a fast-paced life in corporate finance while treating our family heritage like worthless clutter. Everything shifted when Logan unexpectedly returned to our small town, carrying a heavy burden of hidden debts and a desperate plan to salvage his lifestyle. He claimed our grandfather had verbally gifted him the crown jewel of the collection, a pristine, undocumented marine chronometer from the late Georgian era. My family rallied behind his smooth explanations, demanding I hand over the keys to the vault. They viewed his polished demeanor as absolute truth, entirely unaware that my grandfather had ingrained a unique physical validation marker deep within the mechanism's internal gears that would completely expose my brother's elaborate historical forgery to everyone. The smell of machine oil, oxidized brass, and aged walnut wood had defined my world for as long as I could remember. My grandfather, Thomas, had operated his horology workshop out of a converted carriage house at the edge of our property for over 40 years. When he passed away, he left the entire building, along with its specialized tools and extensive inventory of historical timepieces, to me. I had spent my youth sitting on a high stool beside his workbench, learning how to steady my hands while handling delicate hairsprings and balance wheels that were smaller than a grain of sand. To me, the workshop was a sanctuary of quiet precision, a place where time didn't just pass, but was treated with reverence and meticulous care. The pride of our collection was an authentic marine chronometer manufactured in London during the late 18th century. It was a marvel of historical engineering, housed in a polished, 3-tiered mahogany box with brass gimbals that kept the mechanism level against the rocking motion of a ship. Grandfather had spent a decade restoring its intricate detent escapement, and it remained securely locked in our reinforced workshop cabinet, undocumented by public registries to ensure its preservation from predatory collectors. While I spent my days immersed in the quiet mechanics of the past, my older brother, Logan, lived entirely in a world of aggressive futures. Logan had left our hometown the moment he turned 18, viewing our family's modest lifestyle with an unmistakable sense of disdain. He climbed the ranks of a high-pressure corporate brokerage firm in the city, adopting a persona built on expensive Italian suits, imported sports cars, and an exhausting bravado. Whenever he returned for major holidays, he made a visible point of patronizing my career choice, loudly questioning why I wasted my intellect repairing obsolete mechanisms for regional museums and local enthusiasts when I could be generating actual capital in the modern market. He regarded our grandfather's lifetime of gathered historical artifacts as nothing more than a collection of dusty, sentimental junk that merely occupied valuable physical real estate. Our mother, Evelyn, completely adored Logan, viewing his financial ambition as the ultimate realization of family success, frequently hinting that I should follow his footprints out of our quiet valley. I tolerated his arrogance because our paths rarely crossed, content to let him chase his corporate milestones while I maintained the peaceful continuity of the workshop. Everything fractured on a regular Tuesday evening when Logan arrived at our mother's house without any advance notice. I had driven over for our weekly family dinner, expecting a quiet evening discussing community news. Instead, when I walked through the front door, I found Logan already seated at the dining table. Although he was wearing his customary designer clothing, the polished facade was exhibiting subtle, uncharacteristic signs of strain. The cuffs of his shirt were slightly frayed, his posture was unusually rigid, and he was nursing a glass of water with an intensity that signaled deep internal stress. As dinner commenced, the conversation remained superficial until our mother poured the coffee, creating a natural pause in the evening's rhythm. Logan cleared his throat, setting his cup down with a deliberate echoing click against the porcelain saucer, and looked across the table directly into my eyes. He announced that he was restructuring his investment portfolio to navigate an unexpected corporate transition, which required him to liquidate a few private tangible assets. My internal warning system immediately activated when he shifted his gaze toward the mahogany sideboard, his voice taking on a calculated, smooth cadence that he typically reserved for high-stakes client negotiation. He stated that he had come back to collect the 1790 marine chronometer from the workshop, claiming our grandfather had explicitly promised it to him as a private financial reserve during a confidential hospital conversation right before his passing. I sat motionless, the warmth of the coffee completely forgotten as I absorbed the absolute absurdity of his statement. The marine chronometer was not just another historical artifact. It was the definitive anchor of the workshop's value, worth tens of thousands of dollars to high-end institutions, and more importantly, it represented the pinnacle of our grandfather's professional restoration achievement. I reminded Logan that our grandfather's legally registered, notarized will explicitly bequeathed the workshop and all of its physical contents exclusively to me, ensuring the preservation of the collection as a functional historical museum. Logan merely smiled, a cold, patronizing expression that instantly conveyed his utter disregard for legal boundaries or family sentiment. He argued that a verbal directive from the family patriarch carried an ethical obligation that superseded formal paperwork, implying that my refusal would be an insult to our grandfather's memory. Evelyn immediately intervened, her tone dripping with parental authority as she instructed me to stop being possessive over old mechanical instruments. She argued that Logan's current corporate real estate endeavors were far more vital to the family's economic standing than my insistence on keeping a historical relic hidden away in a lock cab. Realizing any further debate would be futile, I stood up, grabbed my jacket, and left the house. The night air was crisp as I drove back with an uneasy sensation in my chest. I bypassed the main residential house and walked straight down the gravel path to the workshop. I unlocked the heavy security door, deactivated the alarm, and turned on the overhead task lamps. The familiar glow illuminated the rows of vintage clocks and intricate gear cutters, but my focus was fixed entirely on the antique mahogany display cabinet at the rear of the room. I retrieved the brass vault key from my pocket, unlatched the reinforced glass door, and lifted the lid of the chronometer's outer protective box. My breathing caught as I stared down at the instrument under the direct light. The brass casing was bright, and the silver dial looked immaculate, but as my fingers grazed the winding mechanism, my professional instincts registered an alarming lack of structural resistance. I leaned closer, examining the microscopic alignment of the screws holding the balance wheel. A wave of intense anxiety washed over me as I noticed a tiny, uncharacteristic blemish on the upper plate, a modern laser-etched serial mark that could only belong to a high-end commercial replica. The stark glare of the workbench lamp felt cold against the polished brass of the instrument sitting before me. My fingers were trembling slightly as I picked up an optical loupe, pressing the magnifying lens firmly against my right eye socket to examine the deeper structural topography of the mechanism. A genuine late Georgian marine chronometer is an assembly of purely hand-filed organic components. Each gear tooth possesses microscopic tool variations, and the metal carries a distinct aged patina that cannot be replicated by automated factory lines. The object resting in the velvet-lined mahogany box, however, was flawless to a fault. The gear valleys were perfectly uniform, displaying the micro-ridged signature of a modern high-speed CNC milling machine. Even the silver dial, while accurately mimicking the classic typography of the 1790 era, lacked the faint natural oxidation that occurs over centuries of environmental exposure. The realization settled heavily in my chest. Logan hadn't just come to dinner to make a demanding request for our grandfather's masterpiece. He had already broken into the workshop while I was away at a regional preservation conference over the weekend, used his knowledge of the facility to access the auxiliary cabinet keys, and swapped the authentic chronometer with a sophisticated, high-end commercial reproduction. He had counted entirely on my busy schedule and my family's technical blindness to ensure the switch remained completely undetected until he could quietly transport the original artifact to an unlisted private market far away from our small town. I carefully set the replica down, my mind racing through the legal and familial implications. If I immediately called the local authorities to report a grand larceny, the situation would instantly dissolve into an unmanageable domestic war. Our mother would undoubtedly claim that Logan had simply borrowed his rightful inheritance early, accusing me of malicious jealousy, and the local police department lacked the specialized forensic knowledge required to settle a dispute over identical-looking antique timepieces. I needed definitive ironclad proof of where the authentic instrument was located, and more importantly, I needed Logan to publicly commit to the transaction so he could no longer hide behind a facade of plausible deniability. I spent the next 3 hours sitting at my secondary terminal, running targeted digital searches across international estate directories, boutique auction platforms, and private antiquarian groups. I knew Logan didn't have the personal connections required to sell an elite maritime instrument directly to a museum without triggering a routine provenance investigation. He would have to use a high-end, rapid-turnover regional auction house that catered to wealthy corporate investors looking to diversify their portfolios into tangible assets. My persistence finally paid off when I navigated to the hidden catalog of the Vanguard Heritage Auction Group, an elite firm operating out of a luxury hotel downtown, roughly 40 miles from our workshop. Their upcoming weekend catalog featured a prominent late edition listing, a newly discovered, completely undocumented Georgian-era marine chronometer, sourced from a private family trust. The accompanying high-resolution photographs showed the distinct wood-grain knot on the outer casing that I had polished myself dozens of times. The listing had an aggressive opening valuation of $45,000, and the consignor was listed under a shielded corporate entity that matched the initials of Logan's primary shell brokerage firm. Instead of panicking or calling his office to demand its immediate return, a calm, strategic resolve took over. I realized that if I stopped him now, he would simply withdraw the item, hide it in a private deposit box, and wait for a more opportunistic moment to liquidate. He needed to be exposed in a setting where his corporate peers and our family could witness the raw data of his deception simultaneously. The next morning, I walked back into our mother's house during her morning garden routine. I deliberately put on an act of exhausted resignation, sitting down at the kitchen counter and sliding the workshop vault keys across the marble surface toward her. I told her that after reviewing our grandfather's journals, I didn't want the responsibility of causing a permanent emotional rift within the family over an old mechanical object. I stated that if Logan truly believed he had a moral claim to the asset for his corporate endeavors, he could take it with my blessing. Our mother was visibly relieved, instantly praising my sudden maturity and calling Logan to deliver the good news. On the other end of the speakerphone, Logan's voice carried an undercurrent of smug satisfaction. He thanked me with a patronizing tone, stating that he was glad I had finally aligned my perspective with reality, and mentioned that he would be celebrating his latest corporate milestone at a prestigious private gallery event downtown over the weekend, inviting both our mother and me to attend as a sign of family reconciliation. He had no idea that the gallery event he was inviting us to was the very same Vanguard auction where my grandfather's original chronometer was scheduled to cross the block. Spent the remaining days of the week preparing my technical counteroffensive. I didn't touch the replica sitting in the workshop cabinet, leaving it exactly as he had placed. Instead, I retrieved a specialized digital macro camera and a thick leather folder containing our grandfather's original private workshop ledgers from July 1998. These ledgers weren't standard text records. They were detailed engineering diagrams of every major restoration he had ever performed. Grandfather had been a deeply cautious craftsman. He knew that rare maritime instruments were frequent targets for forgery and theft, so he had ingrained a hidden, highly specific security feature within the core architecture of the device. On Friday afternoon, I packed the ledgers into my briefcase alongside my identification papers and a certified digital display drive. I called our mother, offering to drive her downtown early so we could secure prime seating at Logan's corporate reception. As we walked into the grand ballroom of the hotel, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, high-end catering, and the low buzz of wealthy collectors reviewing the catalog displays. Logan was in his absolute element, holding a glass of champagne surrounded by his colleague, completely unaware that the briefcase in my hand contained a technical blueprint that would completely dismantle his financial career within the hour. The grand ballroom of the hotel was bathed in a warm, amber light that reflected off the crystal chandeliers and the glass display cases lining the perimeter. Logan stood near the main stage, laughing loudly with a group of senior partners from his brokerage firm. His chest puffed out with the unearned confidence of a man who believed he had executed the perfect corporate heist. When he noticed our mother and me walking toward him, he raised his champagne glass in a mock salute, stepping away from his colleagues to greet us with an insincere smile. "I'm really glad you made it, Mason," Logan said, his voice dripping with condescension as he clapped a hand onto my shoulder. "It takes a big man to admit when his little hobby house can't compete with real-world market liquidity. Tonight, you get to see how the big leagues operate." "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Logan," I replied smoothly, keeping my voice entirely neutral as I adjusted the strap of my laptop bag. "I think tonight is going to be incredibly educational for everyone involved." Our mother beamed, completely oblivious to the undercurrents, patting Logan's arm and telling his colleagues how proud she was of her son's sharp financial instincts. Within 20 minutes, the house chimes sounded, signaling the start of the premium asset block. The crowd filed into the velvet-upholstered seating area, and the main stage lights brightened as the head auctioneer took his place behind a polished mahogany podium. Lot number 14 was called up after a brief sequence of contemporary art pieces. Two assistants in white cotton gloves carefully carried out my grandfather's authentic 1790 marine chronometer, placing its beautiful three-tiered mahogany case onto a velvet-covered pedestal under a high-intensity spotlight. A massive high-resolution projection of the instrument appeared on the digital screens behind the podium, and a murmur of appreciation rippled through the room of collectors. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer announced, his voice booming through the sound system, "we have a spectacular, newly discovered late Georgian marine chronometer kept in immaculate private storage for decades. The bidding for this pristine maritime masterpiece will open at $45,000. Before the first paddle could even rise from the floor, I stood up from my seat in the third row, holding my laptop and a certified display drive. I didn't yell or cause a dramatic scene. I simply walked directly to the technical coordinator's booth at the side of the stage, handed the technician my encrypted drive, and plugged my machine straight into the room's global media switcher. "Excuse me, Mr. Auctioneer," I said clearly, my voice carrying perfectly through the quiet room as the media screen behind him suddenly flashed, overriding the auction house's slick catalog presentation with a stark, black-and-white engineering schematic. "I am the sole legal owner of that specific horological instrument, and I am officially halting this sale under the state's grand larceny and cultural property preservation statutes." The ballroom erupted into a confused wave of whispers. Logan's face instantly lost its flush of champagne warmth, turning an ash-gray color as he rushed toward the stage, his hands clenching into fists. Victoria, the auction house's legal representative, quickly stepped out from the wing, demanding to know what right I had to interrupt a certified corporate consignment. "This item was legally consigned through a private family trust entity," Logan hissed, trying to keep his voice down as his corporate partners looked on in shock. "Security, remove this guy immediately. He's a disgruntled relative trying to disrupt a legitimate financial transaction. I am a master horologist, and I am the sole beneficiary of the Thomas Horological Estate," I stated loudly, looking directly at the auction house directors who had rushed onto the floor. "The individual who consigned this piece does not own it. In fact, he stole it from a locked conservation facility less than 5 days ago, believing that a digital asset swap would hide his tracks. And I have the physical validation markers to prove it right now." My dad, who had driven down separately after reviewing the initial workshop logs I had left on his desk, walked into the room holding the original, notarized copy of our grandfather's will. He handed it directly to the head auctioneer, his expression grim as he looked at Logan. "Look at the screen behind you," I instructed the room, zooming the digital projection 80 times into a highly specialized macro photograph of the chronometer's internal fusee chain and main gear train. Every professional clockmaker leaves an unerasable physical signature on their masterpiece. My grandfather restored this specific escapement in July of 1998. I opened my grandfather's original leather-bound workshop ledger on the projection screen, aligning his hand-drawn schematics with the live micro-imagery of the instrument on the stage. If you look at the third intermediate wheel, I explained, pointing to the microscopic brass teeth on the display. My grandfather used a specialized diamond-tipped engraving tool to file a unique variable tooth depth pattern at coordinate sequence 7, 12, and 22. It reads as a physical Morse code string that matches the exact serial number of his master certification. No modern replica or factory machine can duplicate the natural, microscopic toolware of that specific hand file. The auction house's independent horology consultant, an elderly man with thick glasses who had been inspecting the pieces earlier, walked up onto the stage without being asked. He pulled a specialized magnifying loupe from his pocket, opened the chronometer's rear casing under the spotlight, and spent 2 long, silent minutes inspecting the internal gear valley. When he stood up, he looked directly at the head auctioneer and shook his head. The young man is completely correct. The microscopic identification signatures match the 1998 manual restoration blueprint exactly. This instrument belongs to the Thomas Estate Archive, not the corporate entity that submitted it for listing. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. Logan stood frozen under the chandelier lights, his mouth opening and closing slightly as his senior corporate partners slowly distanced themselves from him, their expressions turning to looks of profound disgust. Our mother sat in her chair, her face completely pale as the realization that her favorite son was a common thief finally broke through her years of denial. The head auctioneer didn't hesitate. He officially withdrew lot number 14 from the auction block, ordering his assistants to pack the chronometer back into its protective case and hand it directly over to my dad and me. The Vanguard security team immediately escorted Logan out of the ballroom into a private side office to wait for the arrival of the regional fraud investigator, his corporate career and social standing entirely ruined within the span of 10 minutes. We drove back to our small town that night with the authentic marine chronometer secured safely in the back seat of my truck. The next morning, I unlocked the workshop door, stepped into the quiet sanctuary of ticking clock, and carefully returned the masterpiece to its rightful place in the central display cabinet. I packed the cheap commercial replica into a box to hand over to the police as evidence, knowing that the precision of my grandfather's craft hadn't just preserved the mechanics of the past, it had completely secured my future.